Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
Professor here at the Rotman School at the University of Toronto, and I've been working with MILE on executive development for the last little while. I'm very, very proud that the Rotman School of Management and MILE have partnered in order to better understand what drives the economic differences between the Muslim world and the rest of the world. So what we're going to talk about today is a very significant benchmarking exercise that we've done. So there are 3 of Rotman's very best MBA students working together with me, and what we've been able to do is, based off of 100 indicators, identify where the Muslim world, the OIC countries, differ, or how they differ, or how they benchmark relative to the rest of the world. Now, it's very important to stress the following point. This is the first of many research projects between MILE and the Rotman School of Management, and what we've been able to do in this first project is to benchmark, to understand, to document how the Muslim world differs on each of these 100 indicators. What the next phase will be to do a statistical analysis to understand how each of the indicators drive the differences in economic prosperity. So as our first speaker will say, when you look at the Muslim world, it's about 22% of the world population, but only about 10% of the world's GDP. So the average income of people in Muslim worlds is only 1/2 of the world average, which is quite a terrible outcome. Why is it the case that the average income in the Muslim world is only 1/2 of what it is in the rest of the world? And what we're doing today is going to begin to shed light on that exact issue. So with that, I'll turn it over to the team lead, Ash.
Thank you, Professor Hejazi, and Assalamu alaikum, Ali. And hello and welcome to our presentation, and thank you for being with us today. My name is Ash Zare, and it is my pleasure to introduce my teammates, Omer Saleem, as well as Abhishek Chaudhary, and we are excited today to present our research on the growth opportunities for OIC economies in making the transition from underdeveloped to developed. And this research was done under the guidance and supervision of Professor Walid Hejazi from the Rotman School of Management, as well as Mr. Imran Zawwar from the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship. And at this time, we would like to extend our gratitude to Mr. Imran and the MILE organization for extending this opportunity to us to learn a great wealth of knowledge through this research. So the agenda for today is just to cover some introductions. We will introduce the institutional opportunities. Abhishek will do that. I will introduce the social opportunities for OIC economies, and Omer will talk about the financial opportunities for OIC economies. And finally, we will conclude. So starting off, just to give a little introduction on what the OIC stands for. The OIC is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It is the second largest intergovernmental governmental organization after the United Nations, and it is consists of 57 member countries, and it spans across 4 continents. The objective of the OIC is to be the collective voice of the Muslim world, and to protect and safeguard the interests of Muslims in promoting international peace and harmony. And the total GDP of the OIC is around 10 trillion, and the population is 1.6 billion. So with that, we want to now talk about, well, how are the member countries, the 57 member countries we talked about? Well, as it turns out, there exists a great disparity among these countries. For example, if you look at their Muslim population, in fact, you don't have to have 100% Muslim population to be a member. For example, Guyana has only 6.4% Muslim population, and it is one of the members of this organization. In terms of population, it is quite concentrated. 20% of the countries in this organization have 80% of the population. It is the same case with the GDP. We can see that the large concentration of GDP exists amongst few countries. So these countries are Indonesia, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and they have 45% of the total GDP. And looking at GDP per capita, we can see the same situation applies, where Qatar has, by a large factor, a greater, almost by 11 times higher the GDP per capita than the average of all the OIC countries. Now, so we see there is great disparity within the OIC. Now, comparing OIC with the world, and Professor Hejazi touched on this in the introduction. Even though the population of OIC in the world is 23%, their share of the GDP is only around 11%. And so that begs the question, if we project that the Muslim population is in fact on the rise, and in fact studies have shown that by the year 2200 it will match that of the non-Muslim, then we believe that OIC member countries must do more to ensure accompanying economic growth. So with that in mind, myself, Omer, and Abhishek, under the supervision of Professor Hejazi, we, as a first step in identifying the growth opportunities for OIC member countries, we decided to benchmark them against the other regions of the world. So to do that, we created a very large database. This database has 700,040 data points in it. It's a huge Excel database. It comes from 7 sources, and to name a few, it is from World Bank, doingbusiness.org, World Economic Forum, to name a few of them, and it spans across 38 years, from 1980 all the way to 2018. The number of countries in it is around 234, and it covers 170 economic indicators. These indicators are in the area of education, labor force, financial, institutional, ease of doing business, and governance indicators, to name a few. And so with that, we were able to benchmark OIC against other regions of the world, and from then on to identify growth opportunities. So with this introduction, Abhishek, my teammate, will take you in depth with our research, starting with institutional opportunities.
Thank you, Ash. Hello, everyone. This is Abhishek here, and I'll be talking to you about the institution development. So after we had the database ready, we decided to break this problem down into 3 parts, as Ash talked about: institutional development, social development, and financial development. And I would like to cite here the Bromowitz paper, which is also referenced in the slide, was instrumental in helping us coming up with this framework. So coming back to the model, I will walk you through the institutional development. So for institutional development, we further broke down into 2 parts, which is the geopolitical system and infrastructure. But before we go to that level of detail, let's first try to understand what institutions mean. And we found that institutions are a set of rules or guiding principles which constrict the behavior of an individual to maximize the wealth or the utility. And the 3 pillars for institutional development, we believe, are the social and the political system, infrastructure development, and the ease of doing business. We club the social and the political system together along with the ease of doing business into geopolitical system. So now let's take a look at each of these one by one. For social and political system, we looked at the various factors which can translate into effective governance, and these factors were consistent with the ones studied by the World Bank. And these factors are voice and accountability, political stability and no violence, government effectiveness, regulatory and quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. So the results that we found are reflected in this chart. So in this chart, if you see, North America is represented in red, Europe is blue, other developing countries which are non-OIC are in purple, and OIC countries are represented in green. And the dotted line shows the world average. And we find that, to our amazement, we found that consistently across all parameters, OIC countries are ranked much below the world average and actually are the worst among all the world regions. Then, so if you look at the voice and accountability, OIC countries are negative, political stability, they are the lowest, government effectiveness, along with the regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption, everyone, the OIC countries are ranked at number 4 among this group of countries that we studied. So then once we identified these factors, we wanted to see if these parameters, they make any difference within the OIC countries. So for that, we decided to break down, split these countries into quartiles, roughly 4 quartiles, each of them representing about 25% of the countries. And we wanted to see if there's any trend in GDP per capita or GDP percent that we can find as a function of where the countries stand in the quartiles. So here is an example quartile table that we wanted to discuss with you. This is about the political stability. And we find that more than 50% of the countries of the world OIC population lives in the quartile 4 countries. So these countries are the worst of the worst when measured up for the political stability and no violence. The difference in GDP per capita across the quartiles is also noteworthy. So moving on to the next quartile table, we looked at the interquartile differences for the OIC countries for the government effectiveness. And we found that almost 70% of the OIC GDP comes from the top quartiles, and the difference among the GDP per capita is again drastic, especially for the quartile 1 countries. So the next quartile table that we looked at was rule of law, and we find that, as before, about 70% of the GDP is coming directly from the top 2 quartiles. So similarly, we did a quartile table on social and political system and other results that can be found in the appendix. But to quickly summarize our findings, we found that Qatar, Bahrain, and UAE consistently ranked in the top 5 among the OIC countries for all parameters. Countries in quartile 1 usually experience higher GDP per capita, and more than 50% of the OIC population lives in the quartile 3 and quartile 4 countries. So now we come to the part 2 of the institutional development, which is the infrastructure development. And the parameters that we looked at were rail lines, total route kilometer, percentage of roads paved off, researches in R&D expenditure, electricity power consumption per capita, and total electricity power consumption. And the results that we found are represented in this chart. Like before, North America is in red, Europe is blue, other developing countries are purple, and OIC countries are in green. And just like before, we find that for most of the parameters, North America and European countries, they lead the pack, and OIC, along with the other developing countries, are almost at the bottom of the pack for all parameters. And I would like to draw your attention to the R&D expenditure, where the OIC countries are very drastically different from the other regions of the world. So then we broke this up again into quartile tables just to see if there's any difference across the quartile tables within the OIC countries. And we find that for the percentage of road paved off, bulk of the GDP contribution comes from the top 2 quartile countries. And interestingly, 60% of the population lives in quartile 2 countries, indicating that having high population might be good for the infrastructure development, especially roads. So next we take a look at the electricity consumption per capita, And we find that almost 90% of the OIC lives in quartile 3 and quartile 4 countries. Also noteworthy is the fact that these quartile 3 and quartile 4 countries contribute almost 60% to the overall GDP. Even more surprising is the drastic difference between the GDP per capita income, which is 22,000 for quartile 1 and only 5,000 for quartile 2. We find that countries contributing highly to the GDP suffer from electricity shortage. So the last table in this section that I want to discuss with you was the total electricity consumption. And we find that more industrialized countries represented by higher GDP contribution contribute almost 90% to the overall GDP and are mostly densely populated as well. So because of this, which they might be ranked at the top of the table. So again, to summarize the results in this section, we found that quartile 1 and quartile 2 countries are the major contributors to the OIC GDP. Electricity consumption per capita represents a critical factor, and higher GDP per capita countries comprise a small percentage of the total OIC population. So now we come to the last parameters of the institutional development, which is the ease of doing business. And the various parameters that we took a look at were starting business, dealing with construction permit, getting electricity, registering property, getting credit, protecting investors, paying taxes, trading across borders, enforcing contracts, and resolving insolvency. And the results that we found are reflected in this chart. So our raw data was the rank of ease of doing business. So in this chart, that translates into the longer a column is, the worst off a country is. So the color coding is similar to before, but the thing that should be observed here is that for all the parameters, OIC countries are ranked the lowest for among all countries, and the difference between the North American, European countries and the OIC countries is almost two times for almost all of the parameters. So which reflects like how poorly OIC countries are stacked when you take a look at the ease of starting business. So then we further broke it down into quartile tables as well to study the interquartile differences, and we found that it reflects an interesting trend for registering property. This table is for the registering property. The GDP per capita is the highest among the top 2 quartile countries, and GDP per capita is also drastically different for quartile 1 countries. Then the next table is the getting credit, which is also an important determinant in starting business. And Omar will shed some light more onto it when he discusses it in his section on financial development. But we find that it is very important as countries which rank higher in the ease of getting credit usually have high GDP, high population, and a high GDP per capita. But we think that to really study the effect on OIC countries, we feel that it is important to take a look at Sharia compliant credit that is available, which might be the next stage of our study. So the next parameter that I'm going to discuss is paying taxes. And we find that just like before, there's a great disparity across GDP per capita, and also an interesting observation is that population for the top countries is only 7% of the total OIC population, which reflects that which points to the benefit of having a low population. So to summarize this section, quartile 1 countries represent dramatically higher GDP per capita. UAE is ranked among the top 5 in 6 out of 10 parameters, and GDP percent along with population percent are mostly high for the top 2 quartile countries. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ash, who will discuss with you about the social development.
Thank you, Abhishek. So talking about the social development opportunities for OICs, when I first started the project, Professor Hejazi posed the question is, Ash, what do you think are the reasons for what do you think is lagging in terms of social opportunities for OICs compared to other regions of the world. And I thought about my own story where I first lived in Iran with my family, and then eventually we moved to Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and later on to Toronto in Canada. And I thought, well, what was the two reasons we did that? Like, let's think of top two reasons. And I could think of two things. First was to really increase my access to education. And second was to improve my chances of future employment. So with that in mind, I decided to take that hypothesis and test it out using the database that we had developed at Rotman. So in doing that, I started very broadly looking at the literacy rates because I expected them to be lower than other regions of the world. And as it turns out, that is in fact the case. The female literacy rate in the OIC region is lower than the world average by 21%. And the male literacy rate is lowered by 13%. Now what's striking about this is that even though on both sides it's lower than the world average, the female is lower than its male counterpart. And the reason why this is important is that we believe that studies have shown this, that enacting policies to generate more economic equality, and one of the ways to do that is by increasing literacy rates, helps in pulling GDP per capita ahead for OIC member countries. Now, digging a little bit deeper into why we think that the female literacy rate is lower, then let's look at the enrollment rates. Let's look at how the females versus males are enrolled in primary, secondary, and post-secondary. In post-secondary, sometimes referred to as tertiary education. And if we look at it for the span of 38 years, we see that the OIC member countries are more dominant on the male side. So ideally, regions of the world, they like to be on the green axis here, where there is equal enrollment, whereas females and males are both equally enrolled in education. However, this shows that the OIC, compared to all other regions of the world, is more dominant on the male side. So now looking at this deeper, we want to see, well, okay, if that is the case, how has it been improving over the years? Has it, is the trend positive or is it negative for OIC, for the OIC region? And in fact, the good news is that it has been improving. Since the 80s, we can see that the enrollment has been now more getting closer and closer on being equal for both male and female. In fact, if you see the green bar that is on this graph, it's shortening, it's coming closer and closer to the center. And in certain areas, for example, for post-secondary education, we can see that the female enrollment has even surpassed the, so more females are enrolled compared to males. So the trend is positive, and that's a good news, but we can see that they're still lagging behind other regions of the world. And the reason why this is important is, well, if you have more females who are educated, they tend to participate in the labor force, and their contribution to household and national income will enhance. Now, when you look at the data like that, it begs the question, well, how is the labor force in the OIC region? And not surprisingly, we see that the ratio of the ratio of female to male workers is in fact lowest for OIC member countries. In fact, for every 2 male workers, there is only 1 female worker. And if we look on the right side, there is a graph there that shows the labor force percentage participation rate, and you can see that the female lags by a large degree to its male counterpart for OIC, whereas you can see for other developing region, which is all the other developing countries except for OIC member countries, they're pretty on par with each other, the female and the male categories. So the reason why this is again important is because studies have shown that positive catch-up effect is in fact greater in countries that make it easier for women to participate in the labor market. Now, digging into the data more closely, Abhishek already introduced the quartile tables to you. So looking at the data, we can see that for the labor force participation rate for the females, the majority of the population in OICs have, in fact, that 54% or lower female participation. So that means at least 89% of the population in the OIC region has the 2 male workers for every female worker. So with that in mind, then it begs the question: well, what is it that they do? What is it? How is the female labor force participation? What does it consist of? And we can see that the majority are in fact self-employed. So in fact, if we look at the second table, we see that the poorer the country, if we were to look at GDP per capita as a measure of that, the more likely females are going to be self-employed. So the reasons for this two observation is the same actually. We believe there are 3 reasons, and first is low levels of economic development in this region. Second is gendered employment social norms, and lastly, it is a capital-intensive industry within this region because the majority of OIC member countries are in the oil and natural gas heavy industries. So now begs the question then, if the females are self-employed, then what is it that they actually do? What is the nature of their ventures? And looking at this data, we find that in fact most of them are contributing family workers. And what that means is that they're not self-employed on their own, but they're actually contributing to a business of a family member who lives in the same household. And often they receive very little to no pay for compensation. If we look at this graph, we see that there is a lighter shade and a darker shade. And what that means is that the darker shade says what's the portion of the self-employed females who are contributing family workers. And ideally, we want this gap between the lighter shade and the darker shade to be as wide as possible. If you look at the North America, for example, in the red, we see this gap is very wide. That means the females have their own businesses, which is apart from what their family is doing. So that tends to contribute more to the country's GDP and the economy as a whole. The trend, fortunately, has been positive. Before it used to be, they used to be 3 times as likely contributing family workers, but now they're 1.5 times as likely to be contributing family workers. And why we're looking at this? Well, if females have to, they find no other opportunities to work in the labor force market than their own family, that could be indicative of a gender biased economic system. Now, well, if we agree that, well, if you're not self-employed, then perhaps you're working for an employer, then I looked at more specifically the females in leadership roles as well as professional roles. So by leadership roles, I wanted to see, for example, female in legislators, in senior officials and managers, and in professional and technical roles. So the right side, we can see that in professional roles, females in OICs are lower than the world average by 11%, and in senior leadership roles, they're lower than the world average by 14%. And this speaks to a glass ceiling for women in this region. And the reason why we're looking at this, well, there have been studies that have been also published in Harvard Business Review that say, well, if the trend of the world is towards a more interconnected global economy, females with their strong, empathetic, patient, humane, and ethical ways stand a greater chance of success in leadership roles. So that's what the studies are now showing. And in fact, if I were to look at how is the OIC doing in terms of the country's distribution in promoting females in leadership roles, we see that the first quartile, the countries who promote this the most are in fact experiencing higher GDP growth. We can see in terms of leadership roles, it is 5.5%, and in professional and technical roles is 5.8%. And the countries that keep coming up in this regard are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan Republic, and Azerbaijan. So I will wrap this section up by just summarizing the points I raised, which first thing is that the female enrollment in primary, secondary, and tertiary education is the lowest for OIC member countries compared to other regions of the world. And in the presence of gendered employment social norms and limited economic opportunities, we have seen that females have secured self-employment in this region, but with the majority being contributing to business operation of a related person living in the same household. And statistically, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan Republic tend to have a high female participation in leadership roles and professional roles. So with that in mind, I will let Omer speak to the financial opportunities for OIC member countries.
Well, thank you, Ash, and I want to thank the attendees once again. As my colleagues have mentioned, social and institutional development is the foundation of a society which provides a platform for further development. Now, the development of financial markets is a critical step in that overall advancement. This statement by World Bank is a mouthful, but it summarizes well the importance and benefits of a well-functioning financial market to a host economy. The crux of the matter is that efficiently working financial markets are the main factor in reducing poverty and raising the standard of living. So what defines a complete economic system? Firstly, it's an efficient financial sector which allocates resources to projects with the highest expected rates of return as well as the highest benefit to the economy. A sophisticated business environment where competitive economies are very networked and advanced in both operations and strategy. Labor market efficiency is defined by a labor pool which is highly skilled, diverse, and readily mobile with complementary regulations. So our database has over 50 variables which cover areas within these three parameters. For this project, we've decided to focus on the efficient financial sector, which further has three main areas: access, liquidity, as well as hedging and diversification. Our hypothesis states that OIC countries are not catching up as quickly as their emerging market counterparts because they are lacking within these three areas. So within access, and we've looked at domestic credit provided by the banking sector, as well as foreign direct investment, both inward and outward. Within the liquidity bucket, we've looked at market capitalization, as well as stocks turnover, which indicates the volume of trades within the market. We haven't specifically looked at diversification yet, as we believe it's an important component, but it involves a wide breadth of options for hedging and diversification, given the intrinsic diversity in the economies of OIC countries as well. So our first variable that we've looked at, I explored the role of the banking sector in providing domestic credit. And effectiveness in this variable results in access to finance, which expands opportunities by lowering financing obstacles for people to start and run businesses, as well as a stable banking sector aids in efficient allocation of domestic savings towards projects which help grow the local economy. And lastly, banks establish a more structured framework for credit lending as opposed to private sources, which make credit less costly. So I ran regressions for this variable against different regions in this chart for the whole period between 1980 to 2011. The results show that OIC countries lag significantly behind all other countries in this group, and you can see that the flow of credit is restricted. So what this indicates is it's only available to a select few within the OIC economies and is neither organized nor regulated. And this has a significant choking effect on the growth of an economy. Another future plan study for this database, as Abhishek had mentioned, would be to look at how much of the domestic credit is provided is actually Sharia compliant. Next, we've split up the OIC countries into 4 quartiles. This quartile tables show us a breakdown of those OIC countries. The first quartile dominates in terms of the credit and GDP per capita, and the percentage of GDP and population are sort of distributed between the first and second quartile. And this indicates that higher domestic credit availability levels are correlated to higher GDP per capita income levels. The anomalies here in terms of GDP per capita in the 4th quartile are driven by Brunei Darussalam, Gabon, and Saudi Arabia. Interesting possibility here would be to combine the governance indicators along with this domestic credit variable to see what the impact really is. It is important to note that the top 5 countries all have much higher than the world average, which almost indicates an over-dependence on the banking credit. Next, I took to analyzing another perspective. I've looked at the nominal GDP for just OIC countries over the last 4 decades. We observed that OIC's nominal GDP as a whole has grown almost 400%. And that leads us to say, hey, you know what, that's amazing. However, when we look at the next slide, we see that this table tells us a very different story, sort of a different viewpoint. This is a breakout of domestic credit as a percentage of GDP, which is provided by the banking sector over the past 4 decades for all the regions. This shows that the development of the banking sector has grown significantly in Europe and North America, thereby attracting capital and investment. Domestic credit for OIC countries has grown due to increasing nominal GDP, but has otherwise remained stagnant and has, in fact, fallen slightly behind 1980 levels. The trend lines here really summarize the difference between the 2 groups. Another viewpoint for exploration here would be to look into the dependence of developed economies on traditional credit and the cyclical nature of it. The boom and bust cycles, which essentially results in recessions. So we want to expand later on in a different study, as a follow-up study, to see the scope of Sharia-compliant credit and its effects on the economic boom and bust cycles. Next, we've explored inward FDI. So this too, from 1980s all the way to 2011, inward FDI has most benefit to host countries which are developing or have heavily protected domestic sectors. Inward FDI also brings technology and wage spillover to the host country, and this flow is actually the very essence of the catch-up effect and greatly accelerates an economy if absorbed within the right parameters. And lastly, studies of spillover effects have had diverse conclusions, with most results showing considerable positive effects on expansion, but the lack of exact causes. In this table, in the regression table, we see OIC countries have higher inward FDI compared to other developing countries, but are significantly behind the world average, as well as Europe and North America. OIC countries thus need to focus on areas which will help attract more FDI to accelerate their growth. The quartile table for inward FDI has a concentration in the first quartile, both in terms of percentage of GDP, percentage of inward FDI, as well as the GDP per capita. We can further explore the factors driving correlation between inward FDI, population, and GDP per capita. The 4th quartile, is important to note, is very far behind. However, the GDP growth in that quartile is the highest. Next, we look at outward FDI, which shows a similar trend as inward FDI. It's important to determine for the cause of outward FDI, whether it is due to poor domestic competitive environment or if it reflects the competitive advantage of a domestic firm. Global expansion by the domestic companies help bring in expertise and technologies back to the domestic economies. It's also important to note at this point that some studies have shown empirical evidence that outward FDI may adversely affect domestic investment. When we look at the regression table, we can see that OIC countries are quite a bit below Europe and North America, as well as the world average. Thus, focus for OIC countries should be to provide the right environment for domestic firms to thrive and develop competitive advantages. The quartile table for outward FDI shows that the first quartile once again dominates. Fastest growing OIC countries are in the first quartile and also have the highest outward FDI and highest GDP per capita. It's important to note how far the fourth quartile is compared to the first quartile. Next, this regression table shows the variable of market capitalization of the listed companies. This shows the size and depth of the market as a percentage of the GDP. So market depth is an important component of an economy, and a robust market attracts capital, which can then be allocated efficiently to other projects which contribute further towards the growth of the host economy. We look at the chart, and it appears that even though the OIC countries have the lowest percentage, they're still not that far behind Europe and North America. 40% compared to about 55 to 63%. However, when we look at this from a different angle, we see the same variable, market capitalization, in terms of dollar value. And then we can see a stark difference in the actual depth. Not only do our OIC countries have the lowest percentage of GDP, they're significantly behind the actual dollar value in market capitalization. The difference is a little over $2.5 trillion, which is alarming. The results from this quartile table show that the first quartile is dominant. This indicates that the top 5 countries which have a reputation within OIC countries for having developed stock markets are actually leading the pack. Important takeaway here is that countries in the other 3 quartiles should emulate as the market capitalization and GDP per capita seem to be correlated. Next, we look at liquidity, and OIC countries have better liquidity than other developing countries. However, they are less liquid than Europe and North America, which are hovering around 60%. So what does this tell us? This implies that the transaction costs are higher in OIC countries, and there is a higher perceived risk due to liquidity, which deters inflow of capital to OIC markets. The quartile table for the liquidity factor is highest in the first quartile and then drops significantly. The rest of the areas are concentrated in the first and second quartile. Liquidity is highest for those economies with developed financial markets. So with that, we come to the summary of the financial development sector. So the bottom line here is that lacking in the financial development area has significant bottom line effects on the economies and everyday lives of the OIC population. Lack of opportunity and lower income levels are a result of this lack. OIC countries need to invest significantly to build up their financial sectors and database, and this database can help identify areas for focus as well as the countries which can serve as benchmarks for those areas. So we hope that with this presentation we've demonstrated some of the variables in this presentation. However, this was only one slice of the pie and only one dimension really. This database was a result of our benchmarking project, and there are over 100 more variables in the database, and an analysis on either singular variables or combination should yield powerful results. We hope that this database will allow future research to be done, which should yield causes for the lag in economic development. We hope this will lead to specific target areas which OIC countries can use to tackle to improve the quality of life of their residents. We want to take this opportunity once again to thank the Mile Institute for guiding us and helping us with this research. Thank you, and we can now take questions.
All right, thank you very much. Folks, we have Q&A session now open, so if you have a question, you can either post your question in the question box or raise your hand to speak directly with the speakers or panelists. Let me take, there are a couple of questions in the question box. There's an interesting question. What steps OIC is taking in enhancing trade and economic cooperation between the Muslim countries? Did your study identify any such indicators showing the cooperation among them?
Basically, we didn't look directly into OIC countries. However, the quartile tables outline the top 5 countries within each variable. And the reason for that is that we wanted to highlight that, you know, due to the big disparity between the OIC countries, there are significant number of countries within the OIC membership that are doing well above the world average. And our benchmarking effort essentially highlights these top 5 or 6 countries, and that essentially serves as a platform for other countries who are in the lower quartiles to help basically emulate what they're doing well. So I hope that sort of sheds light on that question.
We could see a time. Sorry, we could see a time trend. Yes, sorry, we could see a time trend in a few of the parameters. We didn't break out all parameters, but the few that we did break out into timeline, we could see a positive effect, like the OIC countries are improving
and coordinating their efforts.
Okay, we have a caller. We have Dr. Muhammad Faridi. Could you please introduce and ask the question?
Salam, I'm a professor here in Saudi Arabia. And I first of all would like to congratulate Professor Walid and their team for wonderful work they have done focusing on the OIC, GIC countries.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, holistically, yes, it's in the long way to go. But what I think is, as a strategy for prospectively for GIC, OIC they have to break down into certain areas moving forward. First, my strategy will be like in the OIC members, they have to first see the best in class. And Ash, as well as Omer, and the other colleague has done a wonderful job of seeing the first 5, the top 5 of them, and then, hello?
Please go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, to break down first, have to have a narrow down perspective, seeing the OIC members who are the benchmark, the best in class, and then the members which are lagging behind, they have to start the benchmarkers among the members have to start helping through a cooperative or a collaborative approach in moving them forward. Especially countries where the liquidity aspect is high. These countries in the OIC have to kind of have some angel investors kind of putting the investments in certain regions where the disparity of economic can be minimized. And lastly but not the least, I think they need to reform, they have to do restructuring, they lack in leadership, and I think it's a long way, but I'm sure that these all weaknesses which have been surfaced out can be strengths and can be opportunities in due course of time. Thank you very much.
Unmuted. Yeah, thank you very much. We agree with the statement that you just made right now. Thank you.
Is that about it, Ash? Okay.
Is that about it, Ash? Okay.
Dr. Muhammad Faridi, are you satisfied?
Yes, that were my remarks and my comments.
Okay. All right.
So,
Okay. Let me move to another caller. I might have to mute your microphone because it's giving an echo. Just a second. There is another question. What steps OIC as an organization body itself is taking to emphasize the need to identify these gaps that you have illustrated? Have they done any such study in the past which you have presented today?
Unmuted.
Basically, it's studies like these, research like this, that helps identify action areas. As we've touched base, this database was a result of the benchmarking effort, and our subject matter was the OIC member organization as a whole. So we're hoping that this database will result in future studies which will essentially dive deeper into aspects and areas which are concerned with OIC. In terms of the actual research being conducted by the OIC, their website has a number of publications which, basically correlate with some of our hypotheses. Obviously, we haven't done as much deep research as it's available on their website, but we're along the same sort of parallels as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, coming to your point, like we didn't find any directly OIC focused study that pointed out these factors, but that's what we were thinking. That part 2 of our study might be focused towards like prioritizing what are the parameters that might have the most significant effect on the OIC countries, and what things that they have already done or they have taken care of. So that was what we were thinking we'll study in the part 2 of our study, but we did not come across any direct study that pointed out these factors.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much. We have Brother Faisal Khan. Whether you have a question, would you like to introduce and speak? I believe. Oh, let me see. Brother Faisal has already posted it in the question box. The question from Brother Khan is how we can increase OIC GDPs as it fluctuates between 7 to 8 trillion USD, whereas US GDP is itself $16 trillion.
Unmuted.
So that comes back to essentially the 3 factors we talked about, the institutional, social, and then financial aspects. And we believe that those are sort of the building blocks that once you establish those, you have the absorptive capacity to expand on further areas. And as you've seen from our research results, GDP per capita is essentially what you want to increase. And that seems to be directly correlated to many of the factors that we've explored. So once we believe that once the OIC countries can set up the infrastructure and sort of set up those factors and grow them, GDP per capita will be the byproduct from that development.
Right. Yeah, it'll be a gradual, what we see it as a gradual effect as we take care of the basic needs, start improving from number 1 thing, that we might see a domino effect. For example, if we improve the education, that might translate into, better, more employment or more R&D expenditure. So things will be interconnected.
Okay, this is Professor Hejazi. All of the points made are absolutely spot on, but one thing that's very important is that there's not a silver bullet. There's not one development that could be done that would allow the Muslim countries to increase their GDP or their GDP per capita, but there's a whole set of developments that need to be done. But I do want to highlight the work being done at the World Bank on governance, and it is believed that the most important set of factors is the governance. So when you think about effectiveness of government, rule of law, control of corruption, and those kinds of issues, protection for intellectual property, these sort of government initiatives that enhance the environment within which business operate, these are sort of the frameworks that are very important in order for all of the other factors like financial market development, human capital, and R&D, in order for those to really impact the outcomes on GDP. So governance is very, very important. Thank you.
Very much, Professor Hejazi. Just one last question. Do we have any data on the contribution of entrepreneurs impacting the overall GDP and or the number of successful entrepreneurs being produced on the world map from OIC countries? Let me unmute.
I'm muted. Yes, well, in terms of entrepreneurship, we saw that OIC actually does have the highest in terms of women being self-employed and being entrepreneurial. In fact, even though the majority are contributing to a family member's business, but the majority have empowered themselves, in fact, to establish a business because they were not able to find employment in the economy and in the society, with the reasons that was mentioned, such as gendered employment, social norms, capital-intensive industry, as well as low economic development.
And this is Professor Hejazi, and just to follow on that, I think it's absolutely a remarkable result that Ash just noted, but that the team came up with, is the idea that because there's a relative lack of opportunities for women in many of these markets, one of the results that was highlighted earlier is females in the labor market. The fact that there are so many women being involved in entrepreneurship is actually a statement of the ability of these women to empower themselves. But going back to the broader statement around the importance of institutions, there are many successful entrepreneurs. We actually have a current project ongoing between Rotman and Mile that's actually looking at successful companies and the role of entrepreneurs. But one of the big issues that the Muslim world faces is the brain drain. The idea that many people with the best ideas, the most innovative people, and so on, actually leave the Muslim world and go to the West. And all of the results of their creative ideas and all of the jobs and so on that are created in Europe and North America, not in the Muslim world. So part of that governance piece is how to create an environment where entrepreneurs are able to pursue their dreams within the local Muslim market and benefit the Muslims more generally.
Okay, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar, and I would like to thank you, all of you, Professor Hejazi, Ash Zare, Omer Saleem, and Abhishek, on behalf of MILE for presenting this wonderful presentation, which had very, very interesting statistics that you guys have captured. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Unmuted.
I think our general hope is that this database stems further research into areas which can lead to improvement, and essentially our aim is poverty reduction on a granular level and increased quality of life for the residents of the OIC and other developing countries as a whole.
And also, as we mentioned throughout the presentation, there are opportunities in terms of looking at the financial side with, in terms of Sharia compliance for future studies. And currently, the team taking on this project with MAL is also looking at other opportunities for OICs and is using the database to test their hypothesis further.
Right. And now that we have benchmarked and identified the various parameters and identified how the OIC countries are stacked, I think it will be very critical and very helpful to prioritize these different parameters, like which one is the one that makes the most impact. I think if we can do that, we'll be able to solve 80% of the problem.
And then this is Professor Hejazi again. I would like to say a final thank you to Mile. For those people listening, the Rotman School of Management graduates about 550 MBA students every year. And it's my honor and my pleasure to work with Mile to allow these MBA students to learn more about the Muslim world. And I believe by working together, we can help Mile in their vision of closing the leadership gap. And by doing all of this research together, inshallah, we help the Muslim world improve upon its economic performance. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hejazi, once again, and Omer Saleem, Ash Zare, and Abhishek Chaudhary for a very, very interesting presentation. And we are very overwhelmed with the findings that you have illustrated today. A lot of attendees are asking about if they can get an access to the presentation copy, which we deem that we will be uploading it on Mile Community in the next couple of days. So please stay tuned to the Mile Community. And we are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to watch the recorded version as well. With that note, I would like to end this webinar and conclude it. So thank you very much, all of those who participated in this webinar, for your question, and special thanks to the panelists once again. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, where you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.